today, our communication squad, representing Communication Association of Eurasian Researchers, is introducing topics on communication, which might be very new and maybe in some way unorthodox to this conference. So three of us will be talking about different types of research methods, because research methods is one of the areas that's extremely topical right now, especially in our age of information and misinformation. And this is what's so important about it, is that there is so much bad information, which is very hard to distinguish from good information. Good information pretty much means that there's some research has been conducted about it, or there's some studies have been done about it. So it's based on some solid evidence and solid arguments, and that's what these presenters are going to talk about today, about how to research Eurasia through communication research methods, and they will be looking at different facets of communication studies and different types of research approaches. So the first person in our panel is Carveth, and he's going to talk about using Apologia in crisis communication. So sorry seems to be the hardest word. Rob.
Good morning, and thank you very much for coming at this early hour and late date of the conference. What I'm going to be presenting is, I think, a useful model, both methodologically and theoretically, for understanding crises that occur. They can actually be applied to individual crises, people that are high profile in the media, such as celebrities and politicians, but a lot of the research has emerged from organizational crises, whether it be businesses, or it's non-governmental organizations, or not-for-profit organizations, or even governmental agencies, which might find themselves having to repair their image to the public, because one's organizational image is critical in terms of how people will end up perceiving them, whether or not they perceive them as being working in the public interest or having credibility, that if they say that they're going to do something, they're going to do something. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the United States or Western Europe or Asian countries or Eastern and Central Europe. The same kinds of things are possible across those milieux. So when I'm talking about crises, you can see how kind of high profile and ubiquitous they are. So for example, last year in the United States, we had a major crisis with the fast food chain Chipotle, which actually produces some really awesome burritos. Unfortunately, last year they were producing the awesome burritos with a side of E. coli and other types of diseases, and so that provoked a crisis where actually Chipotle had to shut down all of its franchises for a day so they could kind of go through and improve their quality control. Internationally, two recent crises is FIFA, in which the upper echelon, particularly Sepp Blatter, who had been the head of FIFA, and others that were connected with him were found guilty of bribery, and that shook up the organization because of allegations that maybe Qatar's awarding of the World Cup had to do with it being bribed, and whether or not maybe that will still hold. And then also, most recently, Volkswagen, which had provided false information in terms of its emissions data, and is not only having to pay billions of dollars of fines to the United States and international markets, but just announced the other day that it was laying off 30,000 people across their organization. And so these crises have important ramifications for not only the companies, but a lot of stakeholders, vendors, customers, governmental leaders, and so forth. And so what I have drawn today is from three different fields of research that I think connect. And to start off methodologically, a lot of this has to do with using a case study method, which is to examine specific cases and analyze them after the fact to see what happened. And also rhetorical strategies that are both out of rhetoric as well as out of the more empirical research literature to see what's effective messaging that will come across. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about how there's more experimental research that's coming about to verify things that are part of this model. And so I'm drawing from three different research traditions looking at crises. The first of these is from Coombs and Holliday's situation crisis communication theory. And while the theory is much more elaborate than I'm pointing out here, what I am drawing from is that they've done a very good job of identifying the type of crisis. You need to know what problem that you're attacking and know it well before you can come up with a solution. And so they have identified that there are three categories of crises. One is minimal crisis with minimal responsibility. And that is things that happen that are largely out of control of the organization. A natural disaster is not something that you anticipate. You try to plan for your response, but you can't anticipate when that's going to happen. You know, the earthquakes that happened in Oklahoma last week, partly because they're doing so much fracking there that they are, laying waste to the ground. Rumors, when, people are starting rumors, and in today's news environment where we have so much fake news out there, rumors can get started really quickly and they can be very, very damaging to an organization. Somebody engages in workplace violence, somebody just flips out. We have this expression in the United States, go postal, because of postal employees gunning down people in a couple of different cases. Or product tampering, the famous case of Tylenol being tampered with during the 1980s. That was something that somebody did to the organization, not that the organization could deal with. And that dictates a certain response. Accident crisis, where there are things that you may be, because of your processes, could have fixed if you had engaged in a lot of quality control. But your responsibility still is low. Operational challenges, that is, a stakeholder files suit and says that you're not maximizing profit, or you are engaging in some sort of green mail or so forth. Technical error accidents in which there's bad coding that might cause a problem, or there's some sort of technical problem that ended up with product harm. Something goes on in a plant. Coke a number of years ago there was a crisis in which school children were getting sick from a fungus that actually came from where they were shipping the bottles of Coca-Cola, and it was a structural problem in terms of how they ended up doing the distribution. And then preventable crises, these are where the organizations really have strong responsibility to. That is, industrial accidents caused by human error are things that usually companies, if they put in the right process controls, should be able to protect. Human error product harm, that usually this is because things haven't been checked out, like with the Challenger crisis. And then finally, some sort of organizational misdeed, which occurs, unfortunately, with all too much frequency, where people are gaming the system somehow. They're not properly auditing the company. And these are where organizations have much more responsibility to. So I'm going to move from situational crisis theory to image restoration discourse theory that was originally outlined by William Benoit. And Benoit came up with 5 categories of response strategies. These are not mutually exclusive. Lots of times companies will, or individuals, will use combinations of these types of strategies in which to try to resolve a crisis. There's the category of denial, and there are subcategories of simple denial and shifting the blame. But basically it's to say, we didn't do anything wrong, or it wasn't our fault. It was somebody else's. They'll shift the blame. Evading responsibility, which is, well, maybe there was something that came about, but gee, we were either provoked, or we didn't have the means to be able to anticipate it, or it was some sort of accident, or we were doing things, we had good intentions, it just happened to be that it messed up. And then there's the notion of reducing offensiveness, which goes through a variety of different kinds of subcategories. ranging from bolstering, well, we're a really good company, we're sorry, but by and large, we do things really, really well, to things like attacking the accuser. If it wasn't for the fact that we have all of these environmental wackos, then we wouldn't be under suit, and so, or we wouldn't have had to cut corners to have to respond to their lawsuits. One of the companies that did this with greatest amount of chutzpah was Merck Pharmaceutical a number of years ago, in which they produced a pain reliever product that actually led to chronic pulmonary obstructive disorder. And they had the data from it, and they hid it from the FDA. And their response was, well, if the FDA didn't have some stringent regulations that slowed us down, we wouldn't have faked the data, or wouldn't have not reported the data. I thought that was chutzpah, as the very definition. Benoit identifies two particular categories that he would suggest are the most effective, and usually used in combination with one another. Corrective action, that is, we agree what the problem is, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't happen again. We're taking steps to prevent that there would be a reoccurrence. And there's an outline of what they're going to do. And then the other thing is mortification, that they actually apologize for the transgression. And interestingly enough, mortification or apology, as I outlined in the title, seems to be the hardest word. Partly because there is this legal notion that if you end up apologizing for a transgression, then that makes you legally culpable, which actually, according to the law, does not. But it does, it's a kind of prevailing theme or mythology within organizations. It's also very difficult to apologize and apologize correctly. We oftentimes hear, "I'm sorry that you feel that way." Well, that's not really an apology. That's really throwing it on you, which is, if you weren't so sensitive and such a little snowflake, then we wouldn't have any problem at all. And so here's where the third level of analysis comes in, and it's provided actually by a philosopher up at the University of New Hampshire by the name of Nick Smith. And he's done, they have actually kind of center for looking at the rhetoric of apologies, particularly looking at it interculturally. But he wrote a book, a couple of different books. One was I Was Wrong, that came out a few years ago, and then he's updated it, particularly looking at the legal field. But what he came up with is this notion of the categorical apology. That is, if you're going to apologize, what are the elements that really make for the best apology? And there are 13 different characteristics. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but to suggest this, that basically you have to, if you mess up, fess up. You got to own it. You have to, tell people that, yes, this is what I did to you. I recognize that you're the victim of this. It was my responsibility. It is my responsibility to make sure that it is going to be taken care of. I am outlining to you why it should be taken care of. That is, what are the kind of ethical principles that are involved here that become important. That you are sincerely regretful. That you actually perform the apology. That you don't let somebody else do it. If you're the transgressor, you actually go and do that. That you indicate what the redress is going to be, how you're going to fix it, how you're going to compensate, and that you do it with both appropriate intent as well as appropriate emotion. That is, you have to look that authentic in delivering your apology. And so basically what this does is extend Benoit's notion about mortification to look at it in a much more nuanced way. There are some types of mortification that are okay. There are types of mortification that are actually much more effective at being able to look at effective apologies. And so to extend this, this is a model that I think that has some promise for analyzing how companies, organizations, responding to crises when they are exposed to it, by identifying the right types of crises, the right type of rhetorical response, and then the right type of apology. Again, a lot of this is based on case study and rhetorical methods. But in the last 5 years, what has been beginning to kind of explode is that there's been a number of different experimental studies looking at very specific types of Benoit strategies and see which is most effective. And for different types of crises, you might be able to say, okay, like a low-level, minimal crisis, a combination of evading responsibility, defeasibility. We didn't really have the knowledge. With a combination of corrective action and mortification is a good combination. With minimal crises, it may be that bolstering your company or good intentions may actually work. And there's probably been another 15, 16 studies that have been using these experimental designs, oftentimes taking scenarios and seeing how people respond to different types of scenarios and what kind of strategies that they would implement. And what's nice about these experimental studies is that while case studies and rhetorical studies often are looking at explanation and understanding, what empirical studies do is that they allow you to come up with more prediction. And that is, they become prescriptive. If you end up employing these things, this is the result that you should be able to predict. And that's a wonderful type of movement in terms of these studies, because if we know what kind of strategies that we can design when we're faced with an organizational crisis, whatever that turns out to be, then we have a better chance of being able to solve that crisis and minimize the damage, particularly in an environment that is much more globalized and, because of communication technology, operates on a 24/7, 365 clock. That things, it used to be you had to respond during the day, now you have to respond by the next tweet. And you need to know going in what you're going to do. And so I think this not only is seeing more promise, but I think it's also something that is not just applicable to the United States, but it's applicable to around the globe. So thank you very much for coming and listening.
Okay, thank you, Rod. Our next presenter is Marta, and she's going to talk about the use of content analysis. So Marta is an expert in media studies and mass communications, and she's going to mostly discuss how we can use quantitative methods to address some very important issues in international relations. And in this particular presentation, she'll be talking about her analysis of the Ukrainian crisis. So the title of her presentation is Combination of Discourse and Content Analysis, Czech and Slovak Internet User-Generated Discussions about the Crisis in Ukraine.
Okay, well, thank you for coming, guys. Sergei has done the very good introduction, so I may as well jump to the beginning of the study. Well, the specific study I will talk about today looks at user-generated content, the particular type of media or content that I have analyzed is this content, which means it is something created by non-professionals, members of wide public, enabled by the proliferation of new media technologies, created through those technologies and posted on the different online platforms. So this type of content would be YouTube videos, blogs, or discussion comments, a number of other things. I have looked at discussion comments. Now, particular study that I'm presenting today was inspired by two recent developments. First development that has sparked my interest into this was allegations that have been brought up by different pundits, journalists, and politicians as well, that the online discussions related to different geopolitical issues such as the Ukrainian crisis, that those discussions have been infiltrated by specific individuals, frequently labeled something like pro-Russian trolls or Russian troll brigades, and different terms have been applied to this, again, alleged phenomenon that there is some coordinated effort to put specific type of information into those discussions. Well, that made me think of, being a researcher of this type of online content, that let's look at some features of this content without getting too much into speculations. Let's analyze it with the tools that we have in order to be able to point out certain facts and see whether some of the things that we are able to track would match some of the allegations that have been, again, brought up by not just pundits, but also, for instance, Slovak President Andrej Kiska has said something along those lines during his New Year speech at the beginning of current year. Then another particular development or event, I should say, that inspired this project was publication of public opinion poll results by the Globsec Institute. They have looked at representative samples of Czechs and Slovaks. The study had been conducted just this year, published just a couple months ago, and one of the questions on the survey was regarding the location of responsibility regarding the Ukrainian crisis. And what the study has found out is that quite significant chunk of those Czechs and Slovaks who have answered this question had actually considers specifically United States and NATO as responsible for the escalation of crisis. So this would be a frame that goes very much along the line of the interpretation of the insurgent and rebel side and the Russian government as well. Just to give you some numbers, it was actually 43% of the Czechs who provided answer do blame United States and NATO for the escalation, and as many as 56% of Slovaks. So again, actually majority of Slovaks in this case. Well, these findings have inspired my hypotheses in this study. So first hypothesis is that there would be difference in frequency of particularly framed user-generated comments. If you look at Slovak and Czech platforms, again, with Slovaks there seems to be a larger number of people who actually align with that rebel and Russian interpretation of the events. And then another set of hypotheses, H2 and H3, is predicting, again, this same trend in terms of support for particularly framed user-generated comments. And this support would be something that we call likes or some other tokens of support that tend to be used on different user-generated content platforms. All right, well, I have applied a mixed methods approach. The first portion of this study was a discourse analysis, which is actually a very qualitative method. I have used Entman's interpretation of framing in order to distinguish the different frames that could be occurring in the interpretation of events in Ukraine. Now, we all are probably familiar with what would be the Ukrainian government and also Western government's interpretation of the events that have taken place, and then how that is different according to the framing model from the insurgents, rebels, and the Russian government's interpretation of the events. But I needed to look at the actual animals in their habitat, so the user-generated content in their natural habitat, and figure out how do these online comment contributors actually reinterpret those frames, whether this official type of framing does indeed match with what they are saying as well. And my findings from 100 comments from a Slovak platform and another 100 comments from a Czech platform have revealed that, yes indeed, you can see the two polarized frames transpiring in the user-generated comments by Slovaks and Czechs. But also there is another distinct third frame that I have noticed, which I just chose to label neutral frame, where they didn't reflect on some type of polarized explanation, but they tried to be either balanced or they were focusing on some very kind of conflict resolution-oriented approach, which would perhaps help the resolution of the situation. Now, the purpose of this qualitative initial study was also to create a code book for the other half of the study, for the content analysis. So the code book would include exact description of the frames and what each of those frame elements needs to look like in order to distinguish those three specific frames. And I'll explain just in a moment how that was used. So again, for the content analysis, so second part of the study, I have drawn another sample of comments from two different platforms in Czech Republic and Slovakia. This time, 77 comments from each platform from the different country. Now, these comments were then coded by me and another coder whom I hired in those three potential mutually exclusive frame categories. Now, what we have been determining is, first of all, the frame, right? Is it the pro-West Ukrainian government, or the pro-rebel, pro-Russian government, or the neutral frame? 50% of this material, so overall 77 comments, were coded by both myself and the second coder in order to determine intercoder reliability. So to make sure that not just I see it, but another person would agree that yes, indeed, it is that frame. And we then calculated the measure for the particular intercoder reliability, which was actually very high reliability between our decisions on framing. Now, the level of support, that was something that we just recorded from the specific platforms, because both Slovak and Czech platform has reported the number of likes and dislikes for the comment. So this was very manifest type of number that we have just recorded and had 100% agreement, basically, between us. Now, when it comes to the actual hypothesis testing, the first hypothesis has been supported, yielding results which show similar trend to actually the GlobeSec's public opinion poll in terms of largest chunk of Slovak user-generated comments being rather aligned with the pro-rebel and pro-Russia interpretation, and the largest chunk of Czech comments being associated with the pro-Ukrainian government and pro-West interpretation of the events. And again, you see some variation there that would correspond to GlobeSec's public opinion poll results. Now, seeing this, what this means in terms of what we know about media effects and mass communication theory is that this is rather likely to represent the opinions that do already exist among the citizens, because with, although not equal, but still having the different frames being represented in the discourse that is happening on the online platforms, there is not necessarily a threat of some spiral of silence and some type of opinion being kind of destructed or not being legitimized when people look at this type of stuff. So I wouldn't, again, be proponent of the assumption that even if these platforms would be infiltrated by some type of people with special agenda, that it would have some extraordinary effects on already existing opinions and trying to sway them in certain directions. Again, as much as we know about the public opinion, the effects of media on public opinion. Now, when it comes to the second set of hypotheses, and specifically hypothesis 2 talking about Slovakia, that one was supported. So this means that on Slovak positive feedback, to get a lot of likes and very few dislikes, and then vice versa. Those who were arguing for the more of pro-Ukrainian government and Western positions were getting a lot of dislikes and not many likes. Now the issue with this is that there was actually too much of a support for this hypothesis, that it, with the number being 55.77 on F, that's kind of extraordinary, you know. And if this wasn't data that we just gotten from the actual website, it would seem like somebody cooked the books for it to actually look that way, right? So the support for the pro-rebel against Russian position was extraordinary. So that seems kind of strange. Now, hold that thought. It seems kind of strange specifically when you compare it to what has happened on a Czech platform, where the hypothesis was not supported, meaning that regardless whether a comment was kind of pro-rebel, pro-Russian, or pro-Ukrainian government and pro-Western, you couldn't really predict how many likes and dislikes it was going to get. It was more equivalent there. So that makes, again, the results for the Slovak platform even more strange. Now, this being said, again, I'm not trying to get to too much of a conspiracy theory type of interpretation of this, that this is some coordinated effort of some type of government or organization. If I was forced to speculate about the reasons for this strange results, I would say that it might be more of an effort of maybe individual contributors to the specific Slovak platform that really wanted to have a specific opinion to be kind of upvoted by the likes and dislikes. And because, again, the same trend wasn't detected on the Czech platform, right? So, again, if this was some type of more of a coordinated propaganda effort in the region, chances are we would find the same strange data on a very popular platform in another country as well. Okay, well, lastly, let me just close by highlighting some of the implications of this methodological approach, so combining discourse and content analysis. Well, first of all, it serves well to describe some phenomena that are interesting to, you know, researchers and perhaps politicians and other relevant individuals and groups. Now, with the more thorough, detailed descriptions, such studies can complement other studies, perhaps some interdisciplinary collaborations that are trying to look to phenomena and debunk some trends that might be going on there. And, you know, lastly, this has the potential to enrich the broader discussion about some relevant issues of today. So thank you guys for your attention. I'll be more than happy to address any questions or